there, Chaudhry here again. I'm a pediatric occupational therapist, and I'm here today to tell you how you can care for kids with different abilities in your ministry. So today we're going to go more in depth with specific strategies for kids that might have a physical disability, kids that might have a developmental disability, maybe a learning delay, or difficulty with sensory processing. So I hope you enjoy it, and I'm so thankful that you're watching this because we want all of our ministries to include every kid. Alright, so before we get into any of this, I just want to start by saying, if you are able to talk to a child's parents before they start attending your program or your ministry activity, that's the best route to go, to find out a little bit about the child ahead of time, maybe meet the child, figure out what their needs are, and what the parent's hoping to get out of the program. So I just want you to keep that in mind before we start. Now, the first category we're going to talk about is often the most obvious one. This would be a physical disability. And you might have kids coming to your program that are using crutches, they might be using a wheelchair, they might be using canes, or they might have something called an ankle-foot orthoses. That's a little kind of insert that might go inside their shoes to help them walk. So the most important thing is, if you have kids that are using special equipment, we need to think about that as actually an extension of their body. This is something they've probably been using their whole life. So we always want to ask permission if we're going to be touching it or moving it in any way. If you have a child that's using a wheelchair and they want help with getting from place to place, it's really important that you go slow. Remember that you're not a pro in using a wheelchair like they are. You want to be really slow when you're tipping that wheelchair up over maybe a little curb or a step, and you want to be mindful of how far the footrests on the chair stick out so you're not hitting that kid's feet anywhere. It's really important with kids in wheelchairs that we're speaking to them at their level, so you don't want to be standing up really tall in front of them and then they're looking up to try to see you, and also you don't want to be speaking to them from behind their chair where they're having to try to crane their neck around to see you. And another thing to consider is where you're placing that child. We want them to be as included as possible in the setting. We don't want them to be off on the side. We don't want them to be stuck facing a wall. And we also want to consider safety. Where are the exits in the building? How will we get them out if we need to? And even something as simple as, like, are they too close to a door that's going to swing open and maybe hit them in their chair? Or if they're using crutches or canes, maybe they can't get out of the way as quickly. So these are all really simple things that we can think about ahead of time. A really easy strategy, if your building maybe isn't fully accessible, maybe it doesn't have doors that swing open, just have those doors propped open already ahead of time if you can, and then it makes it more accessible for everyone. I also wanted to give you a few tips in case you have a child who has vision loss. And one thing we want to remember is that just because a child is using a cane or might have a guide dog, it doesn't mean that they have a total loss of vision. So they might be able to see a little bit. Again, this is where those conversations ahead of time really come into play, so that you know how you can help the best and where you're needed and where you're not. So if they do need some help to get around, we want to make sure that that person is holding on to your elbow. You're not going to be holding the child by the wrist or by the hand. And this is because they're able then to let go of your elbow if they need to. And secondly, this actually gives them a better sense of where their own body is in space and where it is in relation to yours. When you are acting as a guide for someone, it's also important that you tell them where you're going. So for example, in about 5 steps, we're going to turn left. And then leave a pause. We don't want to be talking the whole time through it because it's a lot for that person to listen to, especially if it's a little kid. And we want to be clear with our directions versus saying, for example, soon we're going to go this way. So we want to use our left and our rights and keep it clear and concise. And finally, when you're considering a child with vision loss within your whole program, think about how you're giving the directions. If you're used to giving a lot of visual cues, you're going to want to make sure things are brief and concise, and that child is close enough to hear you. And think about the noise volume of the whole room as a whole, because if there's a lot of chatter and there's a lot going on, that's going to be more difficult for that person. I want to talk a little bit too about kids with hearing loss. This might be something that you might not even notice right away. They might come to your program with a hearing aid. They might use something called a cochlear implant that's actually inserted surgically, and those cochlear implants also snap on and off the side of the skull here. So these are really expensive things, and they're highly personalized, and we don't want anything getting broken. So just be really careful with that. And I think one of the most important things for people who are hard of hearing or deaf is that a lot of them really need to see your mouth. They can lip read quite well, and that helps them put together what you're saying. There's no need to be raising your voice, and some people actually have deafnesses to certain pitches and tones. So if you're really shouting at them, you might just be in that range that they can't hear. So that's not helping anyway. And also when we're shouting, it changes the shape of our mouth, and then that can make it even harder to lip read. One more great strategy for kids who are hard of hearing is to make sure when you're giving directions that you have the kids more in a semicircle, that you don't have them in a single file line. And that's a strategy that makes it easier for all the kids to be paying attention. Now, I guess differently from our kids with vision loss, with our kids with hearing loss, it's important to be using some sort of a visual cue. So when you're getting everyone's attention, you could do something like the clap back to me. They'd be able to see that as well, and you could, if you're doing a racing activity or something, you can be starting with a flag or a big arm movement, and then to make it inclusive for everyone, you can mix a verbal cue with an auditory cue, so they can hear and they can see. And that's what we see in most sporting events for racing. All right, let's talk about kids who might come to our programs that have developmental disabilities. Now, this is a really broad category, but some of the most common things you might see are children who have Down syndrome, for example, or cerebral palsy. And these are categorized as something that happens between birth and 22 years of age, actually, but is going to have a lifetime impact on that child. They're going to be living with this their whole life, and it's going to affect their function in different ways. And often when we see a child with a developmental disability, there's also some other underlying disabilities that they might have. There might be, for example, an intellectual delay that goes along with that, but there might not be. So I think one of the most important things we have to remember about these kids is don't judge a book by its cover. So we don't know, just meeting someone, what their cognition is like, what their communication is like. They might be very slow at communicating, but very quick cognitively. So I think as a rule of thumb, we always want to address kids at their age level. So, you know this child that's coming is 7 years old, so start speaking to them as you would any other 7-year-old. And again, we really want to make sure we're speaking to the person. They might be coming into our ministry with a support worker. Maybe they need a lot of support, and that's fine, but we want to make sure that we're addressing that child all the time. Even if the support worker has to answer some questions and speak up for them, that we're communicating with them. Another really great strategy, again, talk to parents ahead of time. Ask, what level of support will this child need while they're in our program? Sometimes we're able to match those needs by having the one-on-one buddy, and it's great if it can be a child that's around the same age, or maybe a friend that already knows this kid, or maybe a young volunteer that's a little bit older and is helping out with the program. One of the most important things you want to do is make sure everyone's role is really clearly defined. So, for example, if this is a child that needs help in the bathroom, then it's appropriate, if they're bringing their own support worker, that this person is the only person that's going to help them in the bathroom, for example. If they need less support than that, maybe designate someone who's going to be the second leader of a group, and then they'll just kind of sneakily just sort of fade into the background to help that child if they need any help. Next, let's talk a little bit about the difference between an intellectual delay and a learning delay. So in an intellectual delay, we actually see that the person has a reduction in their IQ that makes learning difficult. It might make memory very difficult. But with a learning disability, we see that the way they take in information and organize information is more the difficulty, but they may have a normal or even above average IQ. And that would cover things like dyslexia, for example. So some of the tips for including these kids are very similar. A very easy one that benefits everyone is just make sure that you're giving directions, first of all in a brief way, but in a few different ways. And a great one for all kids is by showing things by example. So you can bring a kid up, for example, if you're doing something related to sports, and then they can show with an adult what the drill is going to look like. We also want to make sure if we're doing more of maybe a Bible learning session that we're not forcing kids to read out loud who might have difficulty reading. We don't want to make them feel bad about that, and we want to make sure that we're sharing that story in different ways. So maybe have all the kids come and act it out afterwards and ask questions to make sure that they're understanding what you're trying to teach. So those are a few strategies that will work equally well with all your kids. Now let's talk about autism. One of my favorite quotes is, "Once you know one child with autism, you know one child with autism." Now it is called autism spectrum disorder, so we'll see kids in different places on the spectrum. So some of them might be very high functioning. You might not know that there's anything going on below the surface and they're really able to regulate themselves well. But some kids, especially our younger kids who might have a newer diagnosis or maybe no diagnosis at all, they're still learning how to filter these different senses out and how to regulate themselves. So people with autism experience the senses very differently from you and I. So they have a lot more difficulty filtering things out and then being able to focus on what's important. So they might be very, very bothered by light. They might experience it especially brightly, and they may be really bothered by sound. Sound's a really big trigger for a lot of our kids. So being in a big group setting or where things are loud and unexpected, that's going to be really difficult for them. You might also see kids that have what we call a tactile sensitivity. So they're bothered, they can't have any tags on their clothes, for example, or they won't touch something that feels slimy. They might be really picky eaters for that reason. And another thing that we all need to remember is that children with autism don't have the same idea of empathy as other kids. So it's really hard for them to see something from someone else's point of view because they're not reading facial cues the same way. So it's hard for them to know how others are feeling and to kind of navigate through that. And that's one of the defining criteria for autism, is these challenges with social interactions. One of the really cool things about autism is that sometimes you'll see people that are really, really strong in one area. So we always want to recognize the gifts that our kids have in our different ministries. And you might see someone who's really strong in math or knows everything in the world there is to know about trains. And finally, you'll often notice that our kids with autism will have some repetitive behaviors. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's important that we are able to decide between what is a really disruptive behavior and what's just repetitive. So sometimes you'll see a kid, for example, they're flapping if they're a bit upset, but they're quiet. So we're going to just let them flap because it's helping them calm their bodies down. We talked in our previous video about the idea of having an inclusion kit available. You might find that your kids with autism really need to take a step back and have some quiet, unstructured time, and then that helps them regulate themselves so that then they can come back into the group. We want to give these kids the opportunity to participate, but just be mindful if there's something that we already know ahead of time that's going to trigger them. Another thing is sometimes kids with autism have a hard time switching from activity to activity, especially if it's something that they were loving doing and then something they don't like doing as much. So we want to give kids lots of warnings for transitions, give them countdowns, use something visual if you need to and if it's beneficial, and just really help them to navigate that. Also, it might help them to know how much time is left. So saying we're just going to do basketball for 5 more minutes and then it's freezy time will help them make it through. We want to know the difference between different behavior and bad behavior. So obviously if someone is getting so dysregulated that they're starting to harm themselves or harm others, then that would be the point where we need to intervene. But if someone's managing, on the sidelines and they're maybe rocking or they're using their squeezy toy, that's okay. That's different and that's fine. We're going to finish by talking about attention deficit disorder and challenging behaviors, because the strategies for these are strategies that work really well for all of our kids. ADD and ADHD are actually the most commonly diagnosed behavioral disorder among kids, and it's more common in boys than in girls, but we do see it in both. When we're talking about a diagnosis, it means that this is to the extent that this is actually impacting the child's kind of everyday life, their social interactions, that they're having so much trouble focusing and filtering out what's not important, that it's getting in the way, even of them doing the things that they themselves enjoy. So when we're working with these kids, it's really important to praise the good behavior, because these are kids that are probably getting in trouble a lot. They're already getting in trouble at school, they're probably getting in trouble at home, so we want to give that positive reinforcement when we catch them doing the good thing. So really call out that good behavior first. Secondly, we want to be really clear about what our rules are and what the expectations are. We want to have the same rules for everybody and know that we expect them to be able to do a good job and follow these rules. If we do have to discipline, we want to make sure that we do it immediately and that it's fairly short. So for example, if something happens in the morning, you don't want to be taking the snack away in the afternoon, because by the time you get to snack time, they're not going to remember, and it's just going to feel to them like you're just taking things away. And with these kids too, we don't want to be piling on all these negative consequences, because then from the beginning of the day, if things start going south, then they're just thinking, well, everything's been taken away already. So just something short and immediate is the best trick. Thirdly, plan ahead. So be prepared, because dead time is the enemy with kids with ADD, and really with any kids. If you don't know what you're doing, everyone's going to start going nuts and getting a little out of control. We want to limit distractions. You want to keep your directions really brief and concise. Know what you're going to say, how you're going to say it, and then move on to the next thing. We also need to keep tabs on our volunteers. Sometimes our volunteers can be a little chatty, or perhaps we're adults and we're a little bit bored with the kids' lesson. We need to make sure that we're setting kids up for success ahead of time by limiting those distractions. And finally, divide your tasks up into smaller pieces. So just give a little piece at a time. And another great strategy is using a visual schedule. Have just a few things at a time to start. Sometimes seeing the whole day laid out for kids isn't necessarily helpful, because it just seems like so much stuff. But if you just use that, first we're doing this, then we're doing this, and then if that's working well, you can add one more. So first we're doing this, then we're doing this, then it's time to go home. And that really helps kids to understand what's expected, how long they need to be doing this for, and then when the end is going to be. Sometimes it's easy to feel overwhelmed by information we're getting about our kids coming in. Maybe we have information about a diagnosis ahead of time, and we might be kind of scared about how we're going to support this person. But we need to remember they're just kids, and more importantly, they're kids that are created in God's image. They're kids that deserve to know how much Jesus loves them and that He has a special plan for their lives, for them just the way they are. So we've given you all sorts of great tips, but the most important thing that I want to leave you with is that we're praying. We're praying before we meet these kids, we're praying during, and we're praying after. God will give us the wisdom. He will help us to love these kids the way they need to be loved. And secondly, we want to be communicating. We want to be communicating with their parents. We want to be communicating with each other about how things are working, whose role is what the expectations are. And we want to be communicating with the kid. How are things going for you? How can I help you? What can I do to make tomorrow a better day for you? I hope these were great strategies for you. I'm really looking forward to seeing how you are going to implement these in your ministry and make sure that all kids receive the love of Christ.